Nazvanya, if you have type O blood, DNA, finally revealed its Native American connection. Isthenari, check your blood type right now. If you don't know it, think about the last time you donated blood or had a transfusion discussed with a doctor. If the answer is O, you are carrying something far older and far stranger than most people realize. Type O is the most common blood type on Earth. Nearly half of all humans carry it. But that global average hides something remarkable. In some populations, O isn't just common, it's almost universal. Among many indigenous nations of the Americas, O-positive blood shows up in 95, in some documented communities close to 100% of the population. Compare that to Europe, where blood type diversity is wide, where A and B and AB all hold significant ground alongside O. Compare it to parts of Central Asia, where B climbs unusually high. Nowhere else on the planet does one single blood type dominate as completely as O does across indigenous America. For decades, this was treated as a curiosity, a footnote in a biology textbook. Scientists have now traced exactly why it happened, and the answer is written into one of the most extreme population events in human history. Before we get into it, if this is the kind of hidden history your Ancestry test never explains, hit subscribe. This channel investigates what your DNA is actually telling you every week. Now let's talk about what type O blood really reveals. To understand why O dominates so completely, you have to go back to a single crossing. Somewhere between 15 and 20,000 years ago, give or take, depending on which model of the migration you follow, small groups of people crossed from Siberia into what is now Alaska, either along a land bridge exposed by lower sea levels or along a coastal route hugging the edge of the retreating ice, a route scientists now call the Kelp Highway. However they came, one fact is beyond dispute. The number of people who made that crossing and whose descendants went on to populate 2 entire continents was small. Genetic models estimate the founding population at only a few thousand individuals, possibly even fewer. This is where blood type becomes a genetic time capsule. When a large population moves through a narrow bottleneck, a small subset splitting off and going on to found an entirely new population, they don't carry the full genetic diversity of where they came from. They carry only what those few thousand founders happen to have. If, by chance, the founding population leaned heavily toward type O, and there is genetic evidence suggesting exactly that among Siberian and Beringian populations of the era, then every single descendant, spread out over the next 15,000 years, across 2 continents, from the Arctic to the tip of South America, would inherit that same overwhelming bias. This is called the founder effect. It's the same principle that explains rare genetic diseases clustering in isolated island populations. Small starting group, disproportionate trait, that trait then dominates the entire future population, no matter how large it eventually grows. But the founder effect during the initial crossing is only half of the story. The second half is darker, and it happened much more recently. Blood type isn't randomly distributed, it's shaped by disease. Specifically, certain blood types offer different levels of resistance or vulnerability to specific pathogens. Type A blood, for example, has been linked in multiple studies to increased vulnerability to smallpox. Type O has shown, in various research, a different and in some cases more favorable resistance profile to certain viral infections, though the science here is still actively studied and the relationship is not simple. When European contact began in the late 15th century, it triggered the deadliest epidemiological event in recorded human history. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, diseases that indigenous American populations had never been exposed to and had zero inherited immunity against, swept across the continent in waves, sometimes moving faster than the European explorers who carried them, jumping from trade contact to trade contact ahead of any actual European presence on the ground. Population loss estimates for the Americas following contact range as high as 80 to 90% in the most severely affected regions within just the first century after 1492. This is, by a wide margin, the most severe population bottleneck ever documented for any human population on Earth. Here is where genetics and epidemiology intersect in a genuinely chilling way. If certain blood types carried even a marginal survival advantage against these specific epidemic diseases, and multiple population geneticists believe this is a contributing factor, that advantage would have been brutally amplified by a population collapse of this scale. A population that started with a founder effect bias toward type O, then lost 80 to 90% of its people to diseases where O may have offered some survival edge, would emerge from that bottleneck even more overwhelmingly type O than it started. Two separate historical forces, one ancient and geographic, one recent and catastrophic, pushing in exactly the same direction, compounding rather than cancelling out. This is why the blood type map of the Americas looks the way it does today. It's not one event. It's the founder effect from the original migration, amplified by one of the deadliest epidemic bottlenecks in human history. Every generation since has inherited the result of both. There's a broader lesson hiding inside a blood type that most people never think twice about. We tend to imagine genetic traits as static facts, something you simply have. Blood type feels almost trivial, a line on a hospital wristband, a fact you need in an emergency. But type O in Indigenous American populations is a genetic record of survival, quite literally written into red blood cells, tracing back through a 15,000-year-old migration and forward through a catastrophic population collapse that reshaped an entire hemisphere in less than 2 centuries. To really understand how unusual this pattern is, it helps to look at how blood type is distributed everywhere else on the planet. In Western Europe, you'll typically find something close to 40% type O, 40% type A, and the remainder split between B and AB. Real diversity, no single type anywhere near dominant. Move into Central Asia, and B climbs noticeably higher, in some populations approaching 30%, a pattern researchers connect to different disease pressures and different founder populations entirely. In parts of West Africa, you'll find some of the highest concentrations of type B outside Asia. Every one of these regional patterns tells its own story about ancient migration, isolation, and disease. But none of them come close to the near-total dominance of a single blood type that shows up across Indigenous America. When researchers first mapped this out in the 20th century, some assumed the data had to be flawed, that sample sizes were too small or too regionally limited to be reliable. Decades of follow-up research across hundreds of distinct communities from Alaska to Patagonia confirmed the pattern was real and remarkably consistent across enormous distances and vastly different environments. That consistency across such a huge geographic range is itself part of the evidence for the founder effect explanation. If local disease environments alone were driving blood type frequency, you'd expect meaningfully different patterns in the Arctic compared to the Amazon, compared to the high Andes, environments with almost nothing in common except one shared ancestral root. Instead, the O dominance holds remarkably steady across nearly all of it. Exactly what you'd expect if the trait were locked in early, during the founding migration itself, before populations ever spread out and diversified into the range of environments they'd go on to inhabit. It's also a reminder of how genetics and history are never separate stories. The disease bottleneck that likely reinforced the dominance of type O across Indigenous America is the same demographic catastrophe that devastated nations, destroyed political structures, and erased an estimated majority of the pre-contact population of 2 continents. A blood type is a small, almost invisible way that history writes itself permanently into biology, carried forward by every single descendant, whether they know the story behind it or not. If you've taken a consumer DNA test and are staring at ancestry percentages you don't fully understand, blood type is actually one of the clearest, simplest genetic markers there is, precisely because it isn't complicated by dozens of ancestral populations blending together the way autosomal DNA percentages often are. But percentages, haplogroups, and blood type together only tell part of the story, and consumer tests rarely explain how to read them properly, or why 2 siblings can get meaningfully different results from the exact same parents. I put together a 24-page guide that breaks all of this down clearly: what your DNA test actually measured, what it didn't, and how to read the result without guessing. The link is in the description, and it comes with a 7-day money-back guarantee. There's one more layer to this story that rarely makes it into the simplified version. The Rh factor, the positive or negative that gets attached to your blood type letter, follows its own separate genetic pattern. Indigenous American populations show Rh-positive blood at frequencies close to 100%, among the highest of any population group on Earth, while Rh-negative blood, though rare almost everywhere, shows up at meaningfully higher frequency in European populations, particularly in the Basque region of Spain and France, an isolated population with its own distinct and still not fully explained genetic history. This means the full blood type picture for Indigenous American populations, O-positive at overwhelming frequency, isn't one genetic story but two: the ABO gene and the Rh gene, both independently shaped by the same founding bottleneck and the same later epidemic collapse, both arriving independently at the same extreme result. One last thing worth sitting with. Type O blood cannot tell you which nation your ancestors belong to. It cannot determine tribal citizenship, and it never will. It's not a marker of identity in that sense. What it is a piece of biological evidence for one of the most extraordinary journeys in human history. A crossing of thousands of miles into a completely uninhabited hemisphere, survived by populations who then endured, and in the vast majority of cases did not survive, the deadliest epidemic event ever recorded. If you carry type O blood, you are carrying a small, literal trace of that story inside you, whether your ancestry is Indigenous American or not, because the same founder effect and epidemic pressure shaped blood type frequencies, to different degrees, in populations worldwide. Comment the number that surprised you most. 1. That some indigenous populations show close to 100% type O blood. 2. The founder effect from the original Beringian migration. 3. The connection between blood type and disease resistance. 4. The scale of the post-contact population collapse. Or 5. The idea that a blood type can carry a 15,000-year-old genetic record inside it. In the next video, we compare the DNA of every documented Native American tribe side by side, and the results rewrite almost everything textbooks assumed about how closely, or how distantly, these nations are actually related to one another.